Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the Master and Fellows of Trinity College, Cambridge for the honor of naming me the Lees Knowles Lecturer for 2022. I would also thank higher powers for making it possible to do this in person rather than on Zoom, and to continue my long association with this university and the teaching of history in it. This is the fourth and final lecture in the series that I shall offer on what I call the civilianization of war. In the previous lectures, I've tried to explore a number of premises. The first is that as war changes, so does peace, and that the period 1918 to 1923 is, for many reasons, an integral part of the war that was launched in 1918. And that war of 1914-18 did not end on the 11th of November, but on the 24th of July, 1923, on the shores of Lake Geneva in the Treaty of Lausanne. One reason why it's necessary to make this correction, I think, in the popular perception of the war, although most historians have now accepted it, is that more people died in conflict, violent conflict, between 1918 and 23 than between 1914 and 18. The latest estimates, which are still being upgraded because of the necessity of looking at victims of epidemic and endemic disease, even leaving out the Spanish flu, who were in the millions in those years. These estimates enable us to say that over 12 million people died in the period 1918 to 23 in the midst of armed conflict, whereas something lower than that, perhaps 11 million died in 1914, 1918. The difference is that the estimates we have show that in 1914-18, probably 70% of those who died wore uniforms, were soldiers, whereas in the period 1918 to 23, 95% of those who died were civilians. There is a change in the gender balance of the victims of war, too, in the second period. It could be called the Greater War, could be called the Second Great War, if you will. There are other ways of naming it. But the wars of 1918 to 23 that spanned an enormous arc from Finland to the Russian Civil Wars, to the Baltic states, south to the Anatolian Peninsula, and extending as well to Morocco and Ireland, only in this part of the story. That enormous series of violent conflicts has usually been excluded from the history of the First World War. One reason to include it is my annoyance with the longevity of Winston Churchill's, shall we say, aphorism of his generation, his time, that he saw in 1918, this division. What he said was, in 1918, in November 1918, the war of the giants ended and the war of the pygmies began. He liked using African racial images to make a point that I think is completely mistaken. The Russian Civil War did not involve a pygmy, but indeed the creation of a monstrous regime whose, I think, warfare in Ukraine today is the shadow of the story I'm going to tell. I want to make the claim that Putin's war in Ukraine is an example of what the civilianization of war looked like. I'm not making claims that he is deliberately moving in that direction. I think you judge people by what they do more than what they say. And in this sense, the story of the civilianization of war, which I believe had many sources, takes a great leap downward, as it were, in the years 1918 to 1923. Of course, there were civilianized wars in the Middle Ages and earlier. But the claim I want to make is that those attempts in the post-Westphalian or post-1648 treaty to regularize and normalize rules of engagement in warfare, as well as the treatment of prisoners of war through the Red Cross, the Hague, and the Geneva Conventions, were fragile steps to control the violence that war unleashes. And that fragility was exposed clearly in the Balkan Wars of 1911, 1913, in the course of the First World War, through blockade, through aerial bombardment, through the Armenian genocide. But after 1918, when, as it were, political legitimacy of the imperial powers in the east of Europe collapsed, there was a regression. I was asked a question last time about comparisons of the 17th century. I'm not sure one can compare horror. Comparative suffering is a subject that I think is best left alone. But at the same time, there is an example of, I think, the creation of a world of violence that had no observable limits in the great masterpiece of Pasternak and Zhivago. If you want to see what I mean by the civilianization of war, read Dr. Zhivago. So that's the setting of these lectures, and this is the fourth of them. Previously, I dealt with the failure of Lausanne in terms of its institutionalization of ethnic cleansing. The compulsory population exchange elements of that treaty were essential to it. The second lecture dealt with the Turkish victory with the Kemalist Republic, in which the great powers, indeed the world order itself, accepted a radical distinction between self-determination and democracy, or the protection of minorities. Self-determination was a phrase used by the Turkish opponents of the Treaty of Sèvres to justify their right to determine the nature of their future. But that future was one that had absolutely no place in it for the protection either of democratic opponents, or that is to say opponents in the political world, or for the protection of minorities. The third lecture was about the way in which Lausanne and its immediate aftermath exposed the, yes, I'll use the word impotence of the League of Nations when Mussolini launched his fleet literally a week after the end of the Treaty of Lausanne, occupying Corfu. The great powers moved not to the League of Nations, which was set up, at least Lord Grey thought so, to control, or at least to provide a possibility of controlling conflict between states. And in this case, there was an ultimatum that was written by Italy, intended for to be rejected, just as the Austrian and Serbian exchanges were intended to be rejected in 1914. So the way in which the League of Nations came out of the Treaty of Lausanne was, I believe, moribund. Appeasement was born at Lausanne. It was, shall we say, developed into a form of art in Munich later on, but it certainly came from an earlier period. So in this last lecture, I want to talk about the failure of Lausanne in another respect. It is a site of the burial of the project for creating an Armenian national homeland. There is no word Armenia or Armenian in the peace treaty. It has been expunged from the Treaty of Sèvres, which was that which had to be changed given the massive Greek defeat of 1922 and the Turkish victory that ultimately led the great powers to recognize the demands of the Kemalist state. And that the primary, as it were, political form of it, there was a human form, namely the compulsory expulsion, or shall we say, removal from Greek citizenship, from Turkish citizenship of people of the Greek Orthodox faith. You should remember that the Treaty of Lausanne established that citizenship was defined by religion, not by ethnicity, but by religion. And those who were Muslim in Greece had no right, with one or two exceptions, to stay where they were because they were Muslim. That the estimates are between 350 and 400,000 Muslims who were forcibly expelled from Greece in those years. Now, what I want to do is to also continue the story that I told you last time about the role of Arnold Toynbee in exposing the, shall we say, horrifying actions of the Greek army in 1921, despite the fact that he was a supporter of the Greek position and indeed of the partition of Anatolia between Armenian and Greek forces, or at least entities. He saw what the Greek army was doing in the Yalova Peninsula. And that action, those series of articles in the Manchester Guardian in 1921 blew away the moral premises of the British government support for the Greek side, and in particular Lloyd George's side. It also did something that I think is unique in Britain, it's not elsewhere, which is it led to the non-renewal of Toynbee's position as Correa's professor at King's College London by the rich people who donated the money for the chair. At least in my memory, there are those in the audience who have longer memories than mine. I don't know of a case where those who gave the money for a chair were able to get rid of the holder of that chair for political reasons. Perhaps it happened, not in my knowledge. I'd be delighted to hear of such a case. But if I'm right that the King's College London case is unique, it really is because of the way in which Toynbee promoted, I would say, a search for the truth in the civilianization of war. It wasn't just the Turkish army doing it to Greek civilians, and they did it with abandon, but it's the way the Greek army did it too. Now let me turn, therefore, to the fourth story, which is a way in which it's not journalists who brought to light the civilianization of war, but the judicial system did it. It's very interesting. This is a repeated story. There's a French story of a man named Schwarzbart a few years later, but in 1921, I want to draw your attention to a murder trial in Berlin, 15 March 1921. On a quiet street in the middle of Berlin, Talat Pasha, who was the 46-year-old former Minister of the Interior and later Prime Minister, Grand Vizier of Ottoman Turkey, was shot in the face and murdered. Or killed, let's put it that way. We could leave it to the jury to work out what had happened. Now, his assassin, Sogomon Tehlirian, on the right here, was a 24-year-old Armenian whose family had been deported during the war. Talat was interior minister and one of the leaders of the Ottoman Turkish war effort who ordered the expulsion of the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia and oversaw the genocide that followed. Over 1 million Armenians died as a consequence, and Tehlirian's mother was one of them. Now, after the war, Tehlirian and others in militant Armenian groups tracked down Talat, who was living under an assumed name in Berlin. And he had Tehlirian took an apartment across the street from him to make sure that he got the right man. Tehlirian shot Talat at point-blank range in broad daylight. Talat, next to his wife, died on the street. Passers-by saw the killer leave the scene of the crime, not very rapidly, as a matter of fact, and within a few minutes, Tehlirian was detained, roughed up, he was beaten up by local people, arrested, arraigned, and quickly brought to trial. What's astonishing is the verdict of the trial. After an hour's deliberation, the jury found that Tehlirian had not committed premeditated murder. He was suffering from, they said, a disordered mind brought about by what we now call the guilt of the survivor. It was evident that Tehlirian had come to Berlin to find Talat and then to kill him. But this act, which he admitted, was, the jury said, that of a man deranged by grief. After he had identified Talat, and this is Tehlirian's lawyer speaking, I put that quote on the screen, he remained calm, and thoughts of vengeance did not occur to him. He carried on as before until 5 or 6 weeks later, when he saw a dream, materially almost like a vision. His mother's corpse arose before him. He told her, "I saw Talat." And his mother answered in the dream, "You saw Talat and you did not avenge your mother's, father's, brothers, and sisters' murders. You are no longer my son." This is the moment when the defendant thought, "I have to do something. I want to be my mother's son again. She cannot turn me away when I go to be with her in heaven. I want her to clasp me to her bosom like before." As the doctors explained, the dream ended when he woke up. Now this was the defense of, if you will, someone suffering from traumatic memory. Tehlirian said he was a killer. He just wasn't a murderer. His act was that of a damaged man speaking on behalf of a damaged people. Many years later, one of his descendants confirmed that Sogomon's mother and eldest brother were indeed killed in the genocide. The others invoked by his mother in the dream survived. What Talleyrand told his counsel, and through him the court, was a story of the fate of the Armenian people as a whole. There are interesting parallels with Rigoberto Menchú, who made up stories that were not factually true, but were collages of stories that other people in her narrative of Central American civilization of war went through. And the jury got the message. They judged not just the murder of Talat, but the murders Talat had set in motion. And when they turned to Talleyrand's motive, they held that what had happened to him and the entire Armenian people was beyond logic, beyond reason, and this is the point, beyond justice. That's what they said. The murder of a nation beggared description and reduced the criminal law to a kind of compassionate silence when a survivor took vengeance. This was a moment of great importance in the life of Raphael Lemkin. The origin of the Genocide Convention of 1948 is here in this trial. And in a number of different forms, Lemkin said that explicitly. This trial and the Schwarzbach trial in Paris, which also led to an acquittal, made him ponder the fact that there is legislation, clearly in most states, to punish the killer of one man, but there's no legislation to punish the killer of a million. That is Lemkin's own position. Now, there were other people who supported Talleyrand there. One of them was Johannes Lepsius, Protestant missionary who had received in 1915 irrefutable evidence that the Armenians were being slaughtered, the Armenian people were being slaughtered. He even got an audience with German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg and begged him to put a stop to the killings. Ottoman Turkey was Germany's allies. Bethmann had replied, his hands were tied, he could do nothing. German commander of Ottoman forces also appeared at the trial, General Otto Liman von Sanders. Talat and his government had ordered the killing, he said, but they were carried out by a criminal force cobbled together during the war in the absence of the Turkish gendarmerie, who were in the army. The general's testimony helped refute the view that the German army was complicit in these crimes. That was the reason he was there. Those in a position to know told the jury that the injury done to the Armenian people by Ottoman Turkish authorities was so monstrous that a young man who had survived had impaired reason. In effect, he had gone mad. Vengeance was an act of insanity, so was the murder of a nation. The jury refused to punish a man and a people. They had already suffered enough. And this is a photograph of Talleyrand hearing the verdict. Many people in the room, there are many different accounts of this trial, were surprised, but Talleyrand and his lawyers were not. It wasn't an isolated event. In Europe, though not in Turkey, public sympathy for the Armenian cause grew at the end of the war, both among victors and vanquished. Many people gave to charitable efforts in the hope of feeding the survivors and stopping the spread of disease in the camps in which they clung to life. The whole world knew that a post-war Ottoman Commission of Inquiry under Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, had found the leaders of the Turkey before he came to power, this is not about Mustafa Kemal himself, had found them guilty of crimes. And many of them had been sentenced in absentia, like Talat. To be sure, the verdict was more a condemnation of the men who had lost the war and an assertion of Turkish sovereignty in bringing them to justice than it was an act of sympathy for their victims. There was a political dimension, too, in the upswell of support for the Armenians. Compassion for the survivors of what we now term the Armenian genocide, outrage at the crime they had endured, were among the reasons the Allies decided to include in the peace treaty drawn up at Sèvres a provision for the creation of an Armenian republic stretching from eastern Anatolia to the Caucasus. That treaty was forced down the throat of the Sultan, that is to say, was signed but never ratified, on the 10th of August, 1920. Again, notice the passage of time. From November 11th, it took until August 1920 to get the Treaty of Sèvres ending the war against the Ottoman Empire and various other subjects established. But it was a very, very lame draft, one that simply could not survive. Look at the size in the middle of the screen of the white area. The white area is what we would now call the Republic of Turkey. Since Wilson and the others said that Turkey had a right to self-determination, that's where it would be, but not in Europe. Over the Bosphorus and Istanbul would be an international zone of the Straits, and then comes the imperial carving up. The Italians in green, the French in blue, and the British in red. So Armenia existed on paper as a republic whose existence was recognized by the Allies and the Allied Commission of Control to make the peace operate, but never in law, since it was never ratified. And the opposition to this treaty is the primary base of Mustafa Kemal's movement to overthrow the Sultan, who was forced to sign this treaty, and to create an independent Turkey not subject to the restrictions that we see. Now, this lecture today tells the story of the shriveling of the dream of the establishment of an independent Armenian state in Anatolia. But it seems to me the map does a better job than I could, for a very simple reason. There were two, as it were, surrogate or satellite wars going on in 1919 to 22. One was the British fighting on behalf, the Greeks fighting on behalf of Britain with a close alliance with Lloyd George, and the other were the Armenians fighting on behalf of the French. There wasn't indeed an Armenian legion in the French army under French officers, and Armenians were trained and indeed armed and had their military training secured by French officers as well. And in both cases, imperial, I would say, overreach led to a withdrawal of support from the surrogate or the satellite. The Armenians lost any chance to have a nation because the French gave them away. Whether we want to call it an abandonment or a betrayal, I'm not sure what the word is, but it meant that they were left alone without political support after 1921, very, very shortly after the treaty was signed. My own view of it, Chris Andrew, who's here, has written about this before, my own view is that it was all about money. That the need to restore the French economy after the war was, shall we say, painfully urgent when the new Russian regime nationalized 1/4 of the portfolio of overseas investments of France, and the second major place where French investments were present were Turkey and Egypt. Very substantial investments, and those had to be protected. The reason why the Greeks were abandoned by Britain finally, I tried to discuss last week. I'll be happy to come back to it if anyone wants to say. But the working for, as it were, a stronger power in a period when both great powers had lost the economic strength needed to run imperial systems is a recipe for political disaster. And in the Armenian case, being, as it were, the client of the French state, led them very clearly to a position that would be almost impossible to sustain. If the French were responsible for the end of the dream of an Armenian republic, they weren't responsible alone. In effect, what happened is that the Russian Revolution triggered a series of military actions, once again after 1918, which turned the Armenian Republic into a Soviet socialist republic. This was a remarkable development, I'll return to it, but it cut the ground out from under Armenian groups all over the world working for a homeland or a state for the survivors of the genocide, for the simple reason that Curzon, Poincaré, others wouldn't touch an Armenian delegation, wouldn't provide it with diplomatic recognition, while in the Caucasus there was a Soviet republic, fledgling Soviet Socialist Republic in action. Now, as I said, delay was fatal for the ratification of Sèvres, and it was bypassed by events the Allies simply couldn't control. Given the new configuration of power in Anatolia, and despite international sympathy for the Armenian cause, a French guerrilla war a Turkish guerrilla war under Mustafa Kemal essentially persuaded the French to withdraw from Cilicia in the eastern part of Anatolia. Now, the question of whether we can view the Armenian, as it were, story as a tragedy built into the Treaty of Lausanne is one that I think most of the participants saw as true. Lord Curzon said that Armenia died a death that was impossible to resist. That's the phrase that he used. So the Armenians took the longest road to Lausanne, and when they got there, they found that there was no place for them. Of course, their search for a republic started well before the First World War, continued in the killing fields of Anatolia, where the bones of the victims remain to this day. The survivors, rejected and outcast, scattered all over the world. Some tried to return to their former homes and rebuild their lives in Anatolia, and we have to recognize the fact that those Armenians who were trapped in the failure of the creation of an Armenian republic were accepted as refugees by the Soviet Socialist Republic established in the Caucasus after the fall of the Tsarist regime. Now, I think what we should understand, and it was very moving for me to do the research on which this lecture is based, in Paris, at this is Venizelos, by the way, signing the Treaty of Sèvres. It was accepted by everyone that Armenia was to be part of the story, except Mustafa Kemal. And his opposition to the entire system is what led to the end of the Armenian Republic. The man on the left, Bogos Nubar, was the head of the Armenian national delegation. He's on the left of this scene. The man on the right is a second figure of importance, whom I'll come to in a moment. Bogos Nubar's father had been Prime Minister of Egypt. He's a dignified 67-year-old gentleman in 1918, was equally at home in Paris or in Cairo. He inherited the relentless energy of his father and shared his father's preoccupation with finding a way around imperial autocrats. And like his father, Bogos Nubar succeeded in doing so only some of the time. He knew everybody in Paris. He could call on members of the Commission on Foreign Affairs to make a public statement on behalf of France's sacred mission to protect Christians under threat. Armenians, Nubar said time and again, had died for the Allied cause. That's true. They had served in the French Foreign Legion and the French officers in the Levant. Over 100,000 Armenians had fought in the Russian army. This belligerency, of course, had been used by the Ottoman state to justify the deportation and murder of Armenians from 1915 on. There were others, but all of them called for Armenia to be seated at the peace conference as an allied belligerent. There they could advocate for the creation of an independent Armenian state, the purpose of which would be, quote, to reunite the fragments of its people torn apart by brutal force, end quote. Nubar's cause was that of this Poland in Asia, which is our Armenia. Now, I think what we have to realize is that there were other ways in which the state, there's Aerevan II. There are two separate Armenian national delegations, one of them in Paris and one of them in Armenia. The head of it with the mustache in the middle is Avedis Aaronian. But I found in the Quai d'Orsay archives that are now in La Courneuve a series of documents in which the Armenian state, which had not been recognized, did what many states in the making do. They set up the trappings of statecraft before they had the right to do so. And what you see on the left-hand side of that is the official Armenian state seal, which was duly affixed to a document giving right of passage to a French air commander who was going to set up a small Armenian air force. But the necessity of creating what would become a state later on, one can find, I would call in the choreography of correspondence that can be seen in the French Foreign Office and European archives today. As I said, the real problem that came out is that the state of Armenia could not survive the withdrawal of the backing of its imperial master, France. But there was another reason why Armenia died and why the Armenian delegation never got to sit at the treaty in the peace delegation in the peace conference at Lausanne. And it's because no one could figure out who would have responsibility for a mandate over Armenia. This is the story of the mandate that never was. In the period 1920 to 21, the French government, as I said, concluded that their occupation of Cilicia, clearly opposed by Mustafa Kemal and the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, was unsustainable. The French didn't have the manpower to impose an even-handed settlement in the Ankara regime and its supporters, who still viewed the Armenian people as hostile to the Turkish national project. They wanted their own country without French, British, and other occupiers. So when the French finally decided there would be no Armenia, and they would withdraw their troops from Cilicia, they effectively left the Armenian cause without a backer, an international backer. There is only one alternative whose hopeful support for this project could be sustained, and that is Woodrow Wilson. But as in so many other stories of Wilson's career in the last years after 1918, it's a story of failure after failure after failure. American backers of the Armenian cause were substantial, and many of them were in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and in the State Department. The problem, though, was that Wilson wanted the U.S. to lead the transformation of imperialism through the mandate system, but he didn't want to have a mandate in as difficult an area as Armenia. And I think the fundamental point is that to sustain the new Armenian state, had the Treaty of Sèvres ever gotten started or been used as a groundwork, would have amounted to a very substantial financial investment to sustain at least a force of 100,000 men. Now, by the way, there's a lot of British discussion in the Foreign Office papers about not wanting this to happen because that would mean the American Navy would be in the Eastern Mediterranean. There was no interest in that story. But I think we have to understand that when the Senate refused to ratify the treaty with a two-thirds majority on the 19th of November 1919, sort of one of the props underlying discussions of an Armenian mandate was knocked out. But it wasn't the only one. The same month, that is to say just at the end of the war, General James Harbord delivered a report to the president urging him to back a solution in which the Armenians would never again come under Turkish rule. This is a very important, I would say, Christian argument for the rescue of a people who had suffered so much under Muslim atrocities. Once again, though, on the 19th of March 1920, that is to say before Sèvres, the Senate failed again to ratify the treaty. Of course, that meant that the United States would not join the League, but it could anyway be a mandatory power under the League for Armenia. That's the sole option left. But the problem was, on the 24th of May 1920, the US Senate turned down that option too. There was what I would call a residual role that the United States could have played, and that was as a power, or indeed an administration, that would be an independent arbiter of the borders between Turkey and the new Republic of Armenia. And I think it's important to recognize this. If you take a look at this map, what's in red now is what's left. That is what was Soviet Armenia until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Notice, by the way, the Karabakh region and all of the fighting that's been going on for many years. There is still an unsettled war there between Azerbaijani and Armenian forces. But if you look to the left of the map, you'll see a very big line under the title, Shrinking Armenia 1918 to 22. You'll see that the area of Cilicia was included in it. Indeed, the French made that clear, that that would be an Armenian area. But then the middle of the line, that extends, as it were, in dots and dashes from the word shrinking and goes into the, as it were, green area, is what was called Wilsonian Armenia. That was the area that President Wilson was going to establish as an Armenian republic, and it would include most of those areas which now define the Armenian republic today. Of course, the delineation of Wilsonian Armenia became a purely academic exercise, and that's because of the military defeats that the new Armenian state suffered. The first was against Turkish forces. In the Treaty of Alexandropol on 2 December 1920, Armenia was not only recognized the loss of Kars, which is now in eastern Turkey, and adjacent territory, but renounced the Treaty of Sèvres. In this treaty, Armenia's armed forces were limited to 1,500 men, and exactly at the same moment, the Red Army took over the rest of Caucasian Armenia. Now, the Armenian Republic was destroyed under the combined weight of Turkish and Soviet forces and French indifference. Once controlled by Bolsheviks, Caucasian Armenia lost the support of the Allies. The only option for Armenian nationalists was to work for the transfer of the recognition of Armenia under the Treaty of Sèvres as a free and independent state to those territories in Anatolia in which Armenians had lived before the genocide of 1915. That's Silesia in particular. You can see the western part of the map. Well, the argument prevailed for a brief moment, and then timing took over, terrible timing. During the last week of November 1920, the League of Nations formally considered Armenia as a full member of the League. The president of the subcommission examining applications for the admission of new states was none other than Fridtjof Nansen, the League High Commissioner for Refugees, the man who had, I would say, brokered the compulsory population exchange, a man who was recognized as au-dessus de la mêlée and could work for those who were suffering displacement and its consequences. The other members of the committee were the Greek Foreign Minister Nicholas Politis, former French Prime Minister René Viviani, and of all people, Lord Robert Cecil, an architect of the League and formerly delegate representing South Africa. These are political heavyweights. They voted to admit Armenia to the League. It came too late. Had this matter been addressed even a month earlier, Armenia would have become a fully fledged member of the League of Nations. Yet again, delay was fatal. The Bolshevik takeover of Armenia in December 1920 made it impossible for the League to adopt the subcommission's report. Here is the wording of their decision. And I quote, "The Commission look with favor on Armenia's application to joining the League, but circumstances do not permit the League to act on the recommendation." Circumstances meant the Bolshevik seizure of power. And there, I think, we can see something very touching I was going to show you in a moment. These are the national delegations. These are people engaged in creating a state. And the documents, the archive of the Armenian National Delegation is split between a beautiful, elegant late 19th century building in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, where Bogos Nubar lived and held court, and Aerevan. But from early 1921 on, the Armenian National Commission turned into the Armenian General Benevolent Union. Human rights to create a state became humanitarian rights. And the Armenian General Benevolent Union is still there. The archive of the national delegation is the door on the right. The archive of the Armenian General Benevolent Union is the door on the left. Armenia died when it went left, when it became the subject of charity rather than of political dealings. Now, on a discordant note, that is to say, the Treaty of Lausanne dealt with a political cause by rejecting two Armenian delegations who came and asked to sit at the table, and there is no mention of Armenia at all in the treaty. On this note, I would like to offer some concluding remarks in the interpretation presented in all four of these lectures. Now, in 4 hours, I've just touched the surface of the history of peacemaking in the period 1919 to 23, and leave aside a rich array of stories of diplomatic achievement and betrayal. I haven't had the time to probe the careful and professional work of the commissions and subcommissions, but I will show you, I think, the record of those. The best record of Lausanne is political cartoons by two Hungarian artists, named Kellen and Darso, who created a series of books of, shall we say, light humor, illustrating, shall we say, can anyone do supercilious better than Lord Curzon with his eyebrows up on the left, or the rather, shall we say, bemused face of, that's Mustafa İsmet, the head of the Turkish delegation, who used as his greatest diplomatic tool his deafness. Whenever someone made a demand, what happened here? Did it go off? Is there a way to turn this back? Oh, there it is. It's back on. Whenever anyone said something that he needed time to consider, he would assert that he simply couldn't hear. Would the delegates please take a few days in order to allow him to get back into the conversation? There is also the extraordinary story of Mussolini, who just came to power. You know, the March on Rome, I think, had its centenary 3 days ago. And Mussolini's first diplomatic encounter was Lausanne. And he used it for a photo op. He enforced Curzon and Poincaré to meet him in the small seaside or lakeside town of Territet, a suburb of Montreux, just so he can be able to say that the great had come to him. And there is one of his diplomatic servants, Count Eugenio Camillo Garroni, who served his master well. There is also, of course, a very vivid French story, and there is Poincaré telling his team, which you'll see the man with the beard who's fourth from the right, who is a remarkable diplomat, Maurice Bompard, and who was the agent for French business in the Lausanne Treaty. He in fact, created a booklet during this time which listed all of the 62 companies that would benefit from the peace treaty being signed. And I mean, these are big players, shall we say. These are the heavy hitters of French overseas investment. I can't really tell the stories. They're there. They are in a book I finished on this subject that Oxford has just published. But I wanted to concentrate for you on the destinies of three nations that was set at Lausanne. They were shaped there: Turkey, Greece, and Armenia. The story of imperial reconfigurations in Britain, France, and Italy I'll have to leave aside. What I would like to offer you is a number of thoughts about the key legacies of Lausanne, and also leave you with some of my feelings about the parallel with the war in Ukraine today that we can see marked by developments 100 years earlier. The first way in which Lausanne scarred the world of international affairs was to give the seal of legality to the erasure from the map of the Armenian state established under the Treaty of Sèvres. You know, this is a remarkable story of peacemaking because the defeated power, Turkey, became the victorious power because Lloyd George made a series of fatal miscalculations that the Greek army could destroy his army. And if that had been the case, the Treaty of Sèvres would have been law. And the Treaty of Sèvres was decided on the battlefields of Anatolia. It was effectively destroyed by the Turkish victory at Dum Lupinar on the 26th to the 30th of August 1922. Had there been such a victory on the Greek side, there would have been an Armenian state in eastern Anatolia, and Turkey would be, shall we say, the size of Bulgaria today. At no point in the Treaty of Lausanne, consequently, is the word Armenia or Armenians mentioned. The Treaty of Lausanne tacitly legitimated the elimination of the Armenian people from Anatolia for the reasons I tried to show in the second lecture, that the protection of minorities within the Turkish state, which was an essential feature of the League of Nations structure, and indeed commitment, was utterly impossible to sustain. In every sense, Lausanne was the victor's peace, not the victors of 1918, but the victors of 1922. That's why so many of the historians of the First World War now talk about the Greater War from 1912 to 1923. Secondly, the Treaty of Lausanne was a total disaster for the League of Nations. The compulsory population exchange agreed on the 30th of January 1923, the linchpin of the entire treaty, showed up the glaring weaknesses of the League's minority rights. The innovation was daring, but ultimately frustrated by the great powers who left the Council of the League of Nations without the means to coerce a state to adhere to its recommendations. Turkey, by the way, was not a member of the League but Greece was, and her delegate, Nicholas Politis, was a central figure in the early development of the League. And yet neither Politis nor anybody else in the League objected to the proposal for the compulsory exchange of minorities. On the contrary, the proposal was brought to the peace conference by Fridtjof Nansen in his capacity as the League's High Commissioner for Refugees. He knew that both the Greek and the Turkish delegations were prepared to accept such a compulsory plan and came forward in order to get it approved with sufficient speed to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the war zone. Nansen's motives were entirely humanitarian, but his plan came with a very high price. Many people have used the term a tragic choice, that is to say, a choice of one of two evils. That price paid for Lausanne was the violation of the rights of the people in Turkey and Greece who didn't want to leave their homes. They had no word in the matter. Their human rights, if that word could be used at the time, had to be sacrificed in order to save their physical lives. There is no better example of what René Cassin termed the Leviathan state than the action of Greece and Turkey in the agreement on compulsory population exchange. It made a mockery of minority rights, not only in Greece, but everywhere else as well. The story of compulsory population exchanges is part and parcel of the developing intellectual and political arguments over what the emerging Nazi party should do. And the Beerhole Putsch is 6 months after this story. There is a lot already written, and a lot I know that will be coming out in the next 6 months about the extent to which the Carl Schmitt's ideology of politics starts when the enemy appears is something that he took very carefully from Lausanne. Now, Lausanne showed dramatically that the League was at best a very minor player in the post-war system of international political affairs. Its work in socio-economic affairs grew even when its political authority was checked. Lausanne wasn't Geneva. Absolute state sovereignty remained the foundation of international affairs. There was a third, unambiguously negative legacy of Lausanne. It was the way in which the compulsory population exchange agreement highlighted and consolidated the process of what I, together with a number of other scholars, call the civilianization of war. The 4 lectures I presented all circle around this phenomenon. Perhaps finally it will be useful to return to this phrase and to try to make it more precise than I have done in the past. Of course, this is a story of the Westphalian system. It's a story of the attempts to, as it were, set up rules of engagement limiting the damage that the weapons of war can inflict, not only on civilians but on soldiers themselves. And it's something that came, I would say, to a crisis through a series of developments that led to what I would like to call a threshold effect. That is to say, in the late 19th century, here I return to Hannah Arendt, the development of imperial power provided many examples of the unbridled use of physical force against civilians in colonial areas. There was no need to refer to the Belgian Congo. We can refer to many other instances that obviously carried on as well. The discussion of the emergence, as it were, of anti-colonial politics in China circles around the Boxer Rebellion. Perhaps 1 million victims of that particular uprising lost their lives. And when we come to the, as it were, to the proximity to the First World War, the Balkan Wars themselves were ones in which atrocities were committed on both sides. Other historians, Stefano von Rousseau among them, believe that it was the violence of the artillery system in the First World War that effectively exploded and destroyed the boundaries between civilian and military targets. You can make the same case for blockade, which in November 1918 continued after the Armistice, which was illegal. It was a punishing system for German civilians. That's what it was for. It was to make sure they didn't reload, as it were, remobilize, but its aim was to make civilians suffer, and it succeeded. It achieved that particular goal. Now, Mark Mazauer has written about the descent of Europe into what he terms the dark continent. By that term, he posits that Europe moved in the interwar years into a period in which authoritarian regimes representing a streamlined nation ethnically defined, grew in power just as liberal and cosmopolitan regimes either disappeared or lost their will or their strength to resist their enemies. The multilingual and multicultural worlds of Saloniki, of Constantinople, of Chernovitz, of Lviv, then Lemberg, had not much longer to live. Lausanne helped seal their fate, a railway station on Lake Geneva. Lausanne was a stop on the way to a long succession of failures leading to the Second World War and beyond. Is it a cliche? I don't think so. The states that won the war of 1914-18 lost the peace. There's been a lot written, and Zara Steiner among them, is when did that happen? I follow the German historian Johann Leonhard, who I think has written the most powerful analysis of this period. He says that the victors were overwhelmed by the violence and chaos the war unleashed, in particular by the Russian Revolution. Lausanne was part of the story of that failure to create a stable international order. The peace conference on the shores of Lake Geneva showed precisely how the post-war settlement constructed by the victorious Allies could be revised. To do so, a disgruntled state needed both an army and the will to probe the weaknesses of the imperial victors, and that is what Mustafa Ismet and Mustafa Kemal did at Lausanne. They even risked breaking off negotiations. They did break off negotiations on the valid assumption that the great powers were too exhausted to go to war. And they were right. Just 7 days after the treaty was signed, on the 24th of July 1923, Mussolini took a trial run at undermining the peace settlement and the League of Nations in another way by his seizure of Corfu. He withdrew from Corfu after a short period, but he learned an important lesson. The great powers did not refer a blatant act of aggression against one of its founding members to the League. Instead, they found a way to accommodate Mussolini in a committee of ambassadors. Corfu, or if you will, the Italian presence in Corfu, was where appeasement was born. Those attending the birth, as it were, 1 week after the end of the Lausanne Conference, included not only Mussolini directly, but watching from Munich Hitler and the Nazis. Their bear-hole putsch failed 6 months after the signing of the Lausanne Treaty, but that was just the beginning of the story. While Lausanne formally ended the suffering of the war between Greece and Turkey, it carried with it an illiberal legacy exploited by the authoritarian leaders of the Dark Continent. The collapse of the peace in 1939, the real, I think, equivalent of a culminating point where Lausanne was a step on the way, was a long time coming, but the unraveling of the international order created to protect that peace began long before. Zara Steiner did suggest that the Treaty of Lausanne was a success. I don't think that claim can be sustained. The primary reason peace broke out in 1923 was exhaustion. The exhaustion of the great powers by the costs and the chaos of war and its aftermath. Lassitude, not pacifism or international law, broke the back of war. The imperial powers lacked the cash to keep large armies in the field and to fund modernized navies to supply them. The immense debt accrued in wartime shackle, though did not eliminate the imperial instinct of the great powers. And the Treaty of Lausanne, I think, brought this mutation into high relief. The key to the settlement was the agreement of 30 January 1923 between Greeks and Turkey on compulsory population exchange. Thereafter, major wars have ended not only with exchanges of prisoners of war, but with mass expulsions or flights of civilians. In Spain, in Greece, in Russia, in Germany, in Poland, in Palestine, in China, in Syria, and today in Ukraine. It seems to me it's important to recognize as it were, the shocking structure of the document. Nobody was surprised by a long section, there are 32 clauses, on the exchange of prisoners of war. But immediately afterwards is a set of 18 clauses on the exchange of civilians. That is what I mean to say. And I think this is the first and the last treaty. I'd be very happy to be corrected on this, in which civilian population exchange is ordained as the condition under which peace could be established. It happens without, obviously, and it's still happening today without it. What happened through the civilian population exchange and its, as it were, successive consequences is what I mean by the civilianization of war. The key element in the Lausanne Treaty was the unmixing of peoples, defined not by ethnicity or any other rule, but by religion. Yes, it was a rapid solution to a particular refugee crisis, and yes, it did save lives. I think we have to recognize that the settlement, as painful as it was, did indeed put a stop to the immediate crisis. But it did become a portent of things to come. From then on, war, with all its terrifying violence, became not just the business of soldiers, but the occasion when armies of non-competent men, women, and children were attacked and thrown out of their homes, sent to live out their lives elsewhere if they were lucky. Now, I think, and I really mean this, I don't know how you separate this subject from those images we've all seen of Ukrainian refugees. I looked just before this lecture at the latest summary, and the latest estimate is between 6.8 and 7.1 million Ukrainians who are displaced persons living outside of Ukraine. I don't know how many Ukrainians are displaced living inside of the Ukraine. It may be even a greater number of that. When we see these pictures, I have a sense of déjà vu. We've been here before. We've seen this before. And in the previous lectures, I did show you the images of similar refugees a century ago. Is it true that I'm speaking about a threshold effect? That's what I said at the beginning. It's not original. 1918 to 23 is not original. It's happened many times before, the American Civil War and afterwards. But slowly but surely, incidents of violence, as it were, create a tendency which is irresistible in the 20th century for the extension of military activity to civilians, not as collateral damage, but as direct targets. And that I take it to be one of the defining features of Putin's war, that he's targeting civilians precisely because of military weakness, that he was unable to achieve a military victory in his first phase. And so the best way to win this war is to kill civilians. Fernand Braudel once noted, "We know as little of war as we do of the true nature of matter. The face of war changes. It is by no means immutable. The civilianization of war has a long history. Inscribed in international law through the compulsory population exchange clauses of the Lausanne Peace Treaty, signed formally on the 24th of July 1923 on the peaceful shores of Lake Geneva, the civilianization of war took a turn for the worse. Now, at the end of these lectures, we should pause for a moment and contemplate the fact that we're living through a similar period and in a similar place. The 1918 to 23 violence was originally, well, I can't say originally because the Russian Revolution happened in many different places, but Ukraine was one of the most violent fields of battle among very different groups in the period 1918 to 23. I've given this lecture in Lviv, and there, during 1914-18, there wasn't a single act of anti-Semitic violence. But in the week after the Armistice, a group of Polish paramilitaries burned down the Hasidic part of the city. It didn't happen when there was, as it were, a legitimate imperial authority there. It happened when everything fell down, when everything broke down. It wasn't a Ukrainian atrocity. It was a Polish atrocity in the city that had been an Austrian and multicultural center and a very rich one long before. If you're interested in that city, I urge you to look at Philippe Sand's East-West Street, which is a story of his family's origins there. I think it's possible to say, too, that there are other ways in which we could sense this sea change in the nature of war and the nature of peace. And there are several letters. I don't have time to read them because I would like to make a suggestion at the end of these lectures, just one more. But maybe Anna Akhmatova is someone we need to refer to. Why is this century worse than those that have gone before? In a stupor of sorrow and grief, it located the blackest wound, but somehow couldn't heal it. The earth's sun is still shining in the west, and the roof of towns sparkle in its rays, while here death marks houses with crosses and calls on the crows, and the crows fly over. Is that blackest wound, the civilianization of war, the fact that when violence happens, it isn't restricted to military activity, but breaks down the fundamental premises that young children have a right to water, that maternity homes should be places of joy, not places of sorrow and mourning. What Putin has done, I think, is something that is cruel in the extreme. But I want to add the structure of international politics makes it almost impossible to argue for a solution that I want to present to you anyway. I know this is utopian, but I want to end the lectures on this note. The Rome Statutes set up the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. If a peace treaty, let's assume Putin's defeat, which must happen in one way or another, this man must be defeated. But if there is to be a peace treaty, that's what I'm talking about in the Lausanne case, it needs to have a judicial element the same way the Dayton Accords did. The problem with that is that it has to come out of the Security Council. And could you imagine even a liberal Russian regime saying yes to the creation of an international criminal court for crimes in Ukraine? It would be a miracle, I would argue, for that to happen, and it's unlikely. My view is no Russian government would last very long if it voted for what I'm advocating, which is the criminalization of the civilianization of war. I believe it is something that we need to address, but there isn't a direct way to address it. All I think that I can say at the end of these 4 lectures is by looking at the boundaries between military action between military units and violence among multiple players in the mutant wars of the 20th and 21st century. By looking at it historically, we have a chance, at least, to bear our responsibility as scholars, to trace some of the cruelest moments of international politics, including those that are going on in Ukraine today as we're speaking. Thank you very much.